Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Who Actually Knows podcast. This is episode 44, and this is a very special birthday episode. Not my birthday, not yours. Maybe it is. Happy birthday if it is. But this is the Who Actually Knows podcast 1 year anniversary, and I'm super excited. I cannot believe that it's been 1 year since I started. February 8th, 2023 was my very first release of my very first podcast episode. It's called She's Doing the Damn Thing. Go listen to it if you have not already. It's pretty funny to see how I've changed in my podcasting. But today is February 8th, 2024, and I have put out 44 episodes. So obviously, if you know 52 weeks in a year, I did not do an episode every single week, just if I wasn't feeling it or whatever. But we are finally at the 1 year mark, and I'm really excited. And I don't want to sit here and boost myself up, but I'm also pretty proud of myself, because when I was preparing for this podcast episode, I did some reflecting. Nothing deep, nothing too serious. My reflecting was going back and listening to my very first ever podcast episode. Like I said, it's called She's Doing the Damn Thing. It was really short, really sweet. And you could hear it in my voice of when I started speaking. I was a little nervous. I was super excited, and you could definitely tell. But it took a little bit for the machine to get warmed up, the engine to get revving. And I'm still like that today. But it was very interesting, thinking about, who I was a year ago, why I started, and the girl behind the mic a year ago, thinking about the girl behind the mic now. And so I'm just very excited to be able to celebrate this with you all, honestly. And also, speaking of celebrating with you all, let's just start by saying thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you're new here, if you've spent some time listening, it means a lot to me. And so this podcast episode is just going to dive into the whole past year and what I've learned. And we're going to get into some takeaways, and we're going to go over why I started a podcast, the creative outlet that it's bringing me, my commitment each week, my ups and downs with it. And also we're going to talk about some celebrations that I have within the podcast, and I wouldn't be able to celebrate without any of you. So to all of my WAC listeners, W-A-K, who actually knows, I will be making that a thing this year. Thank you, and let's get into it. So like I said, I did some reflecting. I went and I listened back to my first podcast episode, She's Doing the Damn Thing. And within that podcast episode, I talked about why I wanted to start a podcast. And podcasting really became something that I had been interested in, just this space in general, in 2022. So about 2 years ago, I was living in Chicago. I was working my corporate job, and I'm very fortunate for the corporate job that I have and still currently have. I'm working with the same amazing people, but I wanted something that was a little bit more fulfilling and very much me. And speaking of finding something that is very much me, I feel like especially, in your 20s, you are looking to find hobbies and things that interest you. And who is Emma at the end of the day? I think we all can pretty much, and hopefully maybe not, identify core values, things that you really like. But how do you identify yourself, and what do you identify with? And I did not know. I honestly, if I'm being completely honest, still to this day, do not know. And I'm figuring it out. But I had this interest in podcasting because I had all of this when I would go on my morning walks. I just had all of this access to information, and I love that. And there were two conversations that I had that I will never forget. So I need to give them a shout out, because this would not be a thing without them. And one was my roommate at the time, who's been on, both of them actually have been guests on the podcast. But Katie Bros has been such a support system. And I remember going on a walk, and I'd always been talking about the podcast I was listening to and just the podcast space. And she was like, Emma, you have to just do it. She's like, you just need to take that leap of faith. You need to do it, and you need to just put it out there. And I was like, okay. okay, sure. Never did. It was in the back of my head. I was like, I'm leaving Chicago. I'm moving. I'm going to LA. Like, I can't think about, adding the podcast onto my plate. Well, I never stopped talking about it, if I'm being completely honest. I was always like, everyone needs a creative outlet. And I would preach that. Like, I would always say it to my friends if they were feeling lost or catching up with people. I was like, you know what? Find a creative outlet and start there. And I was a hypocrite. I didn't even have a creative outlet. So let's flash forward a little bit. After I moved out of Chicago and I had done some traveling and I was getting settled in LA, I was in an Uber with my then boyfriend, David, and he was such a good support system to have. Phenomenal guest if you listen to his podcast episode. But we were in an Uber and we were on our way to the bar and I was just talking. I was like, I keep thinking, about this podcast. Like, I keep talking about it. And I had brainstormed names for the podcast even. Like, I was that far into having this idea. And he was like, Emma, you have to stop talking the talk and you have to walk the walk. And that flipped. It ignited a switch in me. And I was like, okay, you know what? I don't want to be that person that just talks about wanting to do something and never does it. So I have to put a plan and put it into action. So the next Monday morning, I went on Facebook Marketplace. And shout out Facebook Marketplace because that is where I got all of my podcasting equipment, was Facebook Marketplace. I went on there. I just looked at podcasting equipment. I saw the Scarlett 2i2. Didn't know anything really about it. Did my research, watched a bunch of YouTube videos, ended up purchasing it and setting it up, working in GarageBand. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And so YouTube was my best friend. And honestly, the other thing that was my best friend is I would just grab a mic and I would talk behind it and I'd work with my volume and my audio, or I would fake sing, honestly, which kind of just helped me get more comfortable behind a mic because it was pretty uncomfortable when I first picked it up, but then it felt very natural. And right now it feels very natural and I actually really do love it. And then, dove into the YouTube videos on how to start a podcast. And that's where I found Spotify for podcasters, which is the platform that I will upload my audio onto. And from then it was okay, so I have the equipment. I have this idea. I know why I want to start. I have the support system. Basically at that point, it was you know what, Emma, just suck it up and do it. And so I did it. And I was you know what, the reason that I am starting this podcast, besides the whole thing about, having a creative outlet, is for the 20-somethings. And of course, if you guys have been listening, you know that if at the end of the day I can be relatable to one person, that's going to make my day, honestly. And it's going to be full circle for all of this. Because when I was getting into podcasting, I loved what I was listening to. And I have a bunch of podcasters and a podcast channel that I really do love. They just either they had a following, or they were 35 to 40 or very well in their career, had way more life experiences. And I was I love this. I love learning about better ways to improve this or that. But I was I need something almost a little bit more relatable. What about the people who just feel lost, or who are doing their best, or who can talk about the wins of their week and just really be real and raw and natural. And that was when I was you know what? Why don't I just do it? Why don't I just try to do it? And I mean, there's so many different types of podcasts out there, whether it is super funny, super relatable. If I'm being completely honest, I'm not totally sharing all parts of my life with you guys, the really embarrassing, grungy parts. Eventually I will. I think just sometimes it happens and I'm okay, let me just try and grapple it a little bit more before I out myself on all the embarrassing shit I do. But there are a lot of things that I will go through and I'll be you know what? I bet someone else is thinking this. And I've gotten DMs from listeners and been thank you so much for sharing about this topic. I can totally relate. And that is the best feeling. And it honestly keeps me going. There were some weeks, like I said, I put out 44 podcast episodes. So I didn't even do a podcast episode each week for the last year. Because honestly, some weeks I was maybe like under the weather, or I was hungover. I was just like, honestly, I'm just like, it's one of those weeks where I really can't even form a sentence or make sense to myself. I don't know if I'll be able to do it behind a mic. And I didn't put pressure on myself to do it that week. I do remember one time though, there was one week and I was like, you know what? I tried recording an audio. It didn't work. I don't like how it sounds. And my friend messaged me and was like, I cannot wait for this week's episode. And I was like, okay, put my freaking tail between my legs. Like, you're going to figure this out and you're going to put out another episode because people listen and people like it. And that keeps me going. And so, again, this is like also a celebration of 1 year for me and for you listeners, because a lot of it is, you guys keeping me going and why I started the podcast and why I keep going. And I have a big feeling like 2023 was my year of change, like a lot of change, a lot of growth, a lot of setbacks, a lot of things that I really didn't want on my freaking bingo card, but it happened. In 2024, I feel like is going to be great to navigate this together and talk about it and be more open and relatable to all of you. So I am super excited. You guys, this is my creative outlet. This is my Audible journal. And yeah, that sums up kind of like why I started the podcast and why I'm going to keep going with it. The next thing I kind of wanted to talk about, and I've gotten a lot of questions about the commitment it takes each week to do this. So each week, what I do is I will try and brainstorm a topic. And I've done it where it might be the day of, it might be a few days before, it might be a few weeks in advance, especially if I have a guest. I like to get and plan those podcast episodes and record them a week in advance, just to kind of like have them ready and keep going with the brainstorming. And once I have my topic, sometimes I'll do research on TikTok or the internet or look for other people to kind of like bounce ideas off of, whether it's conversations with my friends or other people's opinions. And I take that topic and I do a podcast outline. And so when I do the podcast outline, I go on Google Docs and I've broken it up into my intro, the main content, and a conclusion. And it really helps me, like for this podcast episode, it probably took me like 30 to 45 minutes of what I really wanted to say. I was in the LA Public Library just typing away, and I was able to organize my thoughts and get it all out there so that I'm not as mumble jumbled. I mean, I always kind of am as mumble jumbled behind the mic. And so I'll do that for both solo and guest episodes. Guest episodes, then I'll send it out. They can make notes on it. My solo episode, I'll just like have on my laptop to reference right before I'm recording, day of, etc. So it like takes like 45 minutes. And then also recording, my episodes aren't that long unless I have a guest. My solo episodes are probably like 20-ish minutes. And my guest ones might be 40 to 45. So the recording will probably take 45 minutes to an hour. And then the editing on top of that might take another 45 minutes. It depends. I love my audio to be raw. So I don't edit out filler words. I try not to edit out anything from my solo episodes. And I only edit really out of guest episodes if we had to take a break, if there was a pause, or if they're thinking back and they're like, I said this and I don't want it out there, then I'll just delete it. It's like really easy. And I use GarageBand. I'm trying to level up and figure out what other systems I can use, but that's what I do now. And I've actually been able to like connect with a few other people, get a few video episodes out, and I'll edit that in iMovie. The video episodes, I will say, take a little bit longer. And then I said earlier, I use the platform Spotify for podcasters. So it is the platform where I can upload my audio. I write out my podcast description. I write out the title. I can schedule it for the day and the time for all of the time zones, and it will upload to Spotify at the scheduled time. So that's all in advance. And then when it just uploads, it's automatic. I make sure I hit all my platforms. So Amazon, Google, Apple, and Spotify. Spotify is my number one most impressions that I get. And all of that's on an app or a web browser for Spotify for podcasters. And they are amazing. It is so user-friendly, so seamless. And also something that I really liked is that I can look at all of the listener analytics. So I can look at how many listens I have in the last 7 days for each episode. Were they listening to just the intro? Were they skipping? Where was I losing people? which topics were trending. And also, when everyone gets their Spotify Wrapped, I got a Wrapped for podcasting. So I got to see where everyone was listening from, my most liked podcast episodes, which was super cool and also helps me tailor to like the marketing analytics of it all, which was awesome. And then on the more like creative side, I do try and put out some marketing tactics. I will say something that makes me very uncomfortable, and this is a lesson learned for the podcasting, is TikToks. I'm doing my best with the TikToks, but I try to do TikToks and then I'll put them on my Instagram stories. I created all of the cover art for the podcast, so I use that on Canva. So I'll either just share the link on Spotify on my Instagram story, or we'll use something that I created off of Canva and we'll put that up on my Spotify, or not my Spotify, my Instagram with a link. But we're learning one thing at a time. We are leveling up this year. I will say I'm trying to do video and create a YouTube channel. So that is taking it just one step further. And having the video episode will also help me create like shorts and TikToks. So that is like the commitment each week. I mean, honestly, it'd probably take like 3 to 5 hours, probably closer to 5, but I spread it out throughout like the entire week, with just like breaking it down of what I want to focus on for that day, or maybe, am I focusing it on the weekend or not, etc. But it's super fun. And then the ups and downs of the podcast. So let's just start with we'll end with the good part. So some of the downs that not even downs, honestly, they're lessons learned. I have learned that I need to learn to be okay with being uncomfortable a little bit, because when I first put out this podcast, I was so nervous, not for what my friends or anyone was going to think, but for like that 6th degree of separation, that person that knows of me, of being like, oh, Emma's putting this out there. Is she trying too hard? And I vocalized this to one of my friends. They were like, don't be afraid to be seen trying to be seen. And it really hit home. And I was like, why am I so worried about someone else's opinions? Like, is it really affecting my day-to-day? Like, is it going to stop the sun from coming out tomorrow? No, it's not. The sun is going to come up tomorrow regardless. And I was like, would I rather hold back and not know, or put it out there? Kind of like Jonah talked about on our last episode. You really just have to do it. And you shouldn't be afraid of rejection, because it's probably just growth. And so I had to get okay with being behind a mic and sharing my thoughts and my opinions. And maybe people are looking for a funnier podcast that I'm, giving out, or maybe they're not looking for anything I'm giving out and they don't like it. Then they won't be a listener. And I think that's okay. And I've learned that. Another thing that's kind of uncomfortable for me is the TikToks. And I have a personal and a podcast TikTok. And sometimes I'll create a video and I love it and it's so authentic to me. And then sometimes I create one and I'm like, I'm not sure that was authentic to me. And I'm like still trying to figure it out. I don't post regularly just because sometimes it does feel a little bit weird and I don't want to be ingenuine on what I share. So kind of just like taking mental notes of like, what is making me feel good as I'm doing this podcast? What do I like talking about? How do I like sharing it? Can I mute the opinions? Like, I've had hate comments on a TikTok, which kind of made me feel actually kind of good, because I was like, oh, someone cares enough to comment on it. And it was like some, spam user, 5,892,000, one of those weird numbers. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to like brush that one off. But yeah, I'm like learning to be okay with being uncomfortable. And if I fail, I'll probably learn. And if someone has an opinion, I'm probably doing something right. The other, like, not a huge downer, but like the podcast hit the ground running just as it probably did. And people were sharing of like, Emma's doing this, Emma's doing that. And then now I have a very small, as you guys are listening, a small, very loyal set of listeners. And I'm like so fond of them and I love them so much. It's just been interesting watching the viewers like go down and down. Now we're at like a level playing field. So now it's kind of fun to like learn and interact with you guys and look at those analytics again of like, what is growing? What can I do to make this better? So I'm actually very excited to take that into 2024 and level up with videoing and the YouTube channel and things like that. So now let's get into the wins and the ups and the celebrations, because that's the most exciting part. And I don't know, we'll end on a high note, as you always should. So Some of my wins that I have had are I've learned to use less filler words, and I've learned to slow down my talking and be more sure of what I'm saying as I'm talking. I'll probably use a filler word at some point in here just because we're talking about them, but it has helped me communicate better. Less of a filler words, and also my communication style has been less of, how do I want to say this? A reactive listening and more of an interactive. So when I'm interviewing someone on the podcast, I listen to make sure that my next question isn't waiting for myself to speak. It's actually listening so that I can interact with the listener and we can have a constructive conversation about it. And I've used this communication style in the interviews that I have on this podcast. And then also I've used it at work or with friends, and it's made me connect to people in a deeper level where it's not this reactive listening, just being like, okay, I'm going to listen and wait for my turn to speak because I'll speak about myself. It's an interactive thing to actually connect with someone and speak. And that has been so much fun. I have gotten way more confident in speaking with strangers, and growing up on a wedding venue, having like 250 strangers at your farm every single weekend, I thought I was good at it. I think you can always get better. And that is something that I've loved learning and seeing and growing. Another win, I would say, has been my ability to keep up with the trends in the audio space. So like I said, when I first got into it, I had this big podcast channel that I loved and all these podcasters, but now like being way more adamant about what I'm listening to, why I'm listening to it, and how I can like take some of what they're doing and putting it into my own style has been super fun. And it's allowed me to play around with my style and where I want this to go. And that has been awesome. And another thing that I really want to talk about, and I'll wrap it up here because this is kind of like the take home thing for me. And I've been talking recently, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, but everyone has their set of core values, like what it is, what it means to you and what's important to you. And those are your core values. And maybe you know all of them, maybe you know some of them, but those are the things that you need to stay true to you. And at the end of the day, you also need to know how you want to identify yourself. And if I'm being completely honest, this is something that I'm working on. Like, who is Emma at the end of the day? How do I want to identify myself, and what do other people identify me as or me with? And it's been a huge question mark, and it still is a bit of a question mark. There are a lot of things that I'm like, is this Emma? Is this true to me? And the truest thing that I can stick to, and I've been sticking to, is this podcast. This is the most authentic, real version that I've been. Anything that I choose to share with you has been very real and very raw. And like I said, yeah, there are things that I'm going through and things that are part of my life that I am not sharing yet. And I hope, eventually I will. And maybe this is a great platform to share that with everyone. But it has helped me with my identity and being able to put this out into the world. And I'm very proud of that. And with that, I want to thank you guys all, because I really wouldn't do it if I didn't know I had loyal listeners who interact and like this and listen every single week. And I mean, I just know that there's only one way to go, and it's if I stop and I'm net neutral and what I've done is what I've done, or if I keep going and we can only go up and build this together. So thank you guys so much. Happy 1 year of podcasting to the Who Actually Knows podcast. I'm so excited. And like always, we will talk next week. Bye, guys.